Hi, well, welcome everyone, and thanks for your patience as more of our participants came in. I see a lot of friendly faces here, which is appropriate for the first Cyber Risk Wednesday. I'm Barry Pavel. I am the Vice President here at the Atlantic Council and the Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. In the Scowcroft Center is the Cyber Statecraft Initiative and a number of other practice areas. And so this series is a joint effort by the Atlantic Council and Zurich Insurance, who's just been a terrific partner to help us understand the challenges associated with a project that's looking at where are risks aggregating in cyberspace in a way that's underappreciated or in many ways unappreciated. And so we're really thrilled under the direction of Jay Healy that the Cyber Statecraft Initiative is addressing this really path-breaking project that also has linkages to a lot of the other things that many of us in this room have been discussing in terms of longer range challenges. And so the mission of the Atlantic Council is to promote constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the central role of the transatlantic community in helping to meet global challenges. And as the CEO of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp, says quite a bit these days, we think we're at an inflection point in global history that's very analogous to 1919, 1945, 1989, where leadership really matters and where partnerships across nations and across private sector actors can do a great deal to help us manage this inflection point and advance our mutual interests in very, very important ways. And so in many ways, that's the mission of the Scowcroft Center broadly across all of our work in the Middle East and in Asia and in Europe and in cyberspace and in defense. But it's also really a core aspect of the Cyber Statecraft's initiative's mission as well. That initiative has grown rapidly in the 2 years since it was founded by Jay Healy, whom you'll hear from shortly, to address critical issues in the cyber domain. And the main mission of the initiative is to look at the 3 C's of cyberspace: cooperation, competition, and conflict, and to help sort of demystify cyberspace by focusing on the overlap between it and the traditional domains of national security and foreign policy. And so Cyber Risk Wednesdays is a series that examines the topics at the core of this sort of set of issues. What are the interrelated cyber hazards, and where and in sort of what form is the concentration of cyber risks? And so what we're trying to do here is expose stakeholders, many of you and many others, from different communities, from the technology community, the policy community, risk management, and others, corporate communities, to what are some of the more cutting-edge cyber topics and exchange ideas about it in a relatively informal setting. So this is the first Cyber Risk Wednesday. I don't think I want to go into it anymore. Instead, I want you to do it. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jay Healy, and he'll give you the real scoop on this. But thanks very much for coming.
Afternoon, everyone. Great to see a lot of friends here. So the people running the cameras asked me to stand kind of right here so that we can frame the shot with the slides. But I'm not going to do that for 2 reasons. One is I just landed from the Internet Governance Forum in Bali, Indonesia, and I just landed at 11:15 today. So I need to move around a little bit just so I can keep myself awake. Second, I've got my Nike band, and I still have to earn more points than my wife does on the Nike points. So I have to keep strolling the stage for people that have their Nike bands. Great to see a lot of friends here, and a lot of colleagues from Atlantic Council and in Cyber Statecraft. Also, we are live streaming because one of the reasons that we wanted to do the Cyber Risk Wednesday was to help build a community. First is, of course, to talk about cyber risk, and particularly systemic cyber risk. But also we wanted to help make sure that we had an opportunity for people that are interested in the topic to get together every 3rd Wednesday for at least the next 6 months. We have these planned out, and we'll have the dates up here shortly, so that we can get together, we can talk about this, and we can develop. Because I see a lot of faces in this room that have been involved in this for 10, 15 years, even longer. And we all know that over the course of that time, we've put in a lot of work, but we don't seem to be making that much progress. And I think one of the reasons for that is we lose track of what we've done. We lose track of conversations. We lose track of good ideas. We lose track of people that we want to stay in touch with. We lose track of, you have a mind meld with someone, and then you don't see them again, and you kind of lose the thread. So we really want to provide that opportunity, especially to be talking about systemic cyber risk. So again, our thanks to Zurich Insurance, who helped to make this happen. And I think with that, I am all set to kick in. There's going to be a lot of live tweeting happening during the streaming. It's hashtag Cyber Wednesdays, hashtag Cyber Wednesdays, and you can also follow on your whatever device you like to follow Twitter on. Okay. So I'd like to talk about the project a little bit. I'm going to move over here so that everyone can see that. So this project came about. The Zurich Insurance Global CEO, Martin Sen, said, boy, we really want to start making sure that we can understand what's happening in cyber. And originally, they wanted to look at public-private sector partnerships. And we said, well, that's good, but a lot has been done. So how can we think about topics that we haven't gotten into as much depth on? And Zurich as a company was very interested in about global aggregation of risk. So we said, well, you know what, if you're already looking at global aggregation of risk, it makes sense that we do a one-year effort to look at global aggregations of cyber risk. So we're about halfway through that. So over the next couple slides, you'll hear how we've developed the narrative so far in trying to think about systemic cyber risk. Now, these slides are not meant for this audience. These slides are meant when we're talking with people that aren't used to talking about cyber in general or cyber risks. But the next 4 slides we use to talk to those audiences about, here are the traditional cyber risks, right? I mean, you've got your criminals, and they'll be trying to steal stuff, and hacktivists might steal things or try and disrupt your networks. Spies are going to try and come in and take your R&D or figure out your negotiating strategies. And and militaries are out there, and they might, and we might someday have a cyber war. But certainly there's some covert stuff going on now. And this is all the very traditional way. And many of you have given that same briefing, and you've sliced it in different ways. Maybe you look at it technically. Maybe you look at in several different good ways to tell this same story. But to us, this was all the kind of the traditional way that we got here. And of course, we also have some non-traditional threats, and we'll be talking a little bit during the panel about this, about if these 4 slides represent today's risk. As we're talking to the insurance people and some of the insurance people's clients, we say, well, these are the threats after next. How are the traditional threats going to work in an environment of cloud and mobile and smart grid and Internet of Things? But we found, well, what's the risk after next? What should we be thinking about? And as we started getting to this, we thought about really looking at systemic cyber risk. And this is where we're getting the idea of cyber subprime, which forms the basis of what we're talking about. Originally, you're a very disciplined crowd because you're very polite not to roll your eyes when we said cyber subprime, which is an entirely reasonable thing to do when you hear someone take some analogy and then throw cyber in the front of it. We understand it. Originally, we were using that phrase. We were like, board members or CEOs or other C-suite who might understand that. We put it into their terms. But we really liked it because sometimes you have an analogy that gets your attention but doesn't help you think any further about it. And I've heard General Hayden talk on this about cyber Pearl Harbor. He says, it's interesting, but you stop thinking after that. It's a statement of boo, and then your brain shuts off. What we liked about cyber subprime is we realized it helped us think nth level ideas that hadn't been obvious to us when we started. And that is a useful mental model when you can start doing that. So we make the case that we think cyber is in the same place that the finance sector was prior to 2008. So if you were the president in 2008, or the secretary of the Treasury or Ministry of Finance, and you said, how is our country's finance sector looking at financial risks? You would look at the Bank of Ron Marx, and you look at the Bank of Mark Weatherford, and you say the Bank of Ron Marx is exposed to, say, American subprime mortgages to $1 million, and the Bank of Mark Weatherford is exposed to $100 million. Well, that's riskier, and you might have a really bad quarter, so you have to put aside more money. But you might have a bad quarter. And what did we realize? That we realized that you can't just look at these risks bank by bank, because the shocks came along, the meltdown of the mortgages, the bankruptcy of Lehman, and it didn't matter that much if you had done all the right risks decisions within your bank, because it didn't just give the risky banks a bad quarter, it gave all of us a couple of bad years, even if you weren't exposed to the underlying subprime mortgages. So I see I got finance people in the house, so I'm trying to sound all finance sector-y, right? It's for you, John. And so we said, well, how are we looking now at cyber risks? If the president goes to DHS and Treasury and he says, is our finance sector secure, cyber secure, we go one financial institution at a time, or one energy company at a time, or one manufacturing company at a time, and we look across all of them, and if some sufficient aggregate are secure, we say, yes, sir, we are. But we argue, I'm probably getting ahead of my slides here, that we are at least as complex and interconnected as finance sector was. So, to get myself back onto the slides, we've looked at these 7 concentrations of cyber risk, where we think you can see, if in finance sector the concentrations of risk might have been in subprime mortgages, for example, we see these 7. They're completely overlapping. It's not meant to be a taxonomy, but outsourced and contract. Particularly think about cloud providers. I mean, imagine if one of the major cloud providers had a Lehman moment. It's there on Friday, it's gone on Monday. But also all the other things that are involved in outsourcing. One of my colleagues at one of the Wall Street banks, they went through a very specific process to look at everybody that had access to their information, everybody they outsourced to, look at their business continuity, look at their information security practices, and they realized law firms were their large vulnerability, because the law firms had their most sensitive information and the worst security, and they didn't realize they had that concentration of risk until they looked. Counterparty and partners, supply chain, and that's not just, and I don't mean that to be a stalking horse for don't trust things from China. I mean, what happens if an earthquake hits Silicon Valley? But to think broadly about the things that might disrupt supply chain, disruptive technologies such as Internet of Everything, cloud, mobile, embedded medical devices, upstream infrastructure, particularly electrical, finance, telecommunications. So we consider internet governance and other topics to be in there. External shocks, whether that's conflicts, malware, pandemics, anything else, real conflicts, not just cyber conflicts. And last and finally, internal enterprise. Because a lot of people that's where the conversation about cyber risks normally starts and ends, is the company following NIST standards, say. But we have all of these other risks that we worried that even if someone does that lower right, can correct one perfectly right, that they're still going to be very exposed to cyber risks through these 6 others. So internal enterprise, you've got the most control and it's the least hazard to the system, whereas the others fit in something like that. And of course, over time, technology and business processes is for us to keep pushing more and more out of local control. Now, unfortunately, the good news, we haven't seen that any single shocks or any single shocks can really put us into that state of, oh my gosh, we've had a few bad years here. Cyberspace is really resilient, and it's got a lot of defenders, mostly non-state, but government also, that are there to help keep it that way. But there is plenty of downside that, again, I assert we're at least as complex as the finance sector was, and at least they had models and roomfuls of PhDs that were getting $1 million bonuses to try and figure it out. We don't have that. We have us. And when I was in the private sector, when we were running an exercise, the first thing you'd do in the exercise, say you've got the head of trading and his lieutenants, and the first question you'd ask in the exercise was, all right, who's in charge? And then they would figure out who's in charge, and then it's difficult when we look at if we did have a global systemic shock to answer that question, who's in charge? So our main concern that we're going to look at is what if we have multiple systemic shocks? And we end up with three recommendations for companies. There's some basic things you can do. There's some advanced things you can do. But in the end, resilience is where you're really going to have to come down on. That fits in a lot of things that I think we'll be talking about in the panel. And of course, insurance and risk transfer has an important role to play in that. But we don't think you can model your way out of this. We don't think you can secure your way out of this, unfortunately. And last, for governments or other organizations involved with looking at the system, like ICANN, we're going to have a series of recommendations that we're still working on for ways that we can be at least more systemic in the ways that we're thinking about it. Try and get our focus away from individual companies and start saying what can we do to start looking sector by sector, country by country, cyberspace as a whole to help make ourselves more resilient. So that, I think, ends the formal slides. These are going to be the next set of Cyber Wednesdays. Other topics in the line, we're going to do at least one on insurance. The one we're really excited to do is going to be looking at how we can help measure to figure out where we're doing. Finance, at least they could measure everything. We have difficulties, so we're looking to have Microsoft and OECD and some others come in and talk about what we're doing on trying to come to terms with that. We'd like to do one on finance sector. We'd like to do one on electrical, and I'll be following up with some of you on those topics. I'm going to hold off questions until we get into the panel, because I want to make sure that we have a full hour and a half for that panel. So can I ask my panelists to join me up on stage? Matt, gentlemen. Yeah, you're here.
I'm here.
Mm-hmm. And Matt, can you take the hand? I'll come to you. So for our first Zurich Cyber Risk Wednesday, we wanted to not dive into any of the specific subtopics like finance or electrical in any depth, but instead have a relatively broad panel. The bios are in your, you should have gotten a copy of the bios when we came in, but I thought I would ask for each of the panelists to give just a quick 30 seconds on their background so you can place them and get used to their voice, especially for the people that are live streaming. And then maybe then we'll come back after the introductions, and Jeff, you can lead us off with a couple minutes.
Great. Thanks, Jay. Hi, folks. My name is Jeff Schmidt. I run a boutique consultancy called JAS Global Advisors, where we focus on information security. And I was privileged to be asked by Jay to assist in this project as one of the Atlantic Council's first Zurich Insurance Cyber Risk Fellows. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.
Actually, let's do the introduction, and then we'll come back to you, okay?
Can do.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Larry Castro, currently a managing director at the Chertoff Group, along with my colleague, Mark Weatherford. I retired from federal service in October of 2009 after serving 44 years at the National Security Agency. The last 8 of those, I was NSA's Homeland Security point person. The last 6 of those, from the time the department was established until I retired, I was NSA's senior representative to the Department of Homeland Security.
Thanks, Mark.
I'm Matt Burrows. I recently joined the Atlantic Council around 6 weeks ago as the director of their strategic foresight initiative. Before that, I was the counselor in the National Intelligence Council and produced the Global Trends work. I was the author for the last 3 Global Trends. December 2012, we published Global Trends 2030. It's a document that's used in a lot of planning, very comprehensive, looking across the board at different risks, challenges, and opportunities.
And if you notice in a lot of what I talked about here, I gave nod to the new emerging technologies, but our report's not going to dive deeply into them because, frankly, it changes. It can change so much. And so in the panel, really looking forward to Matt being able to help cast our mind to what that direction is going to be, not just the next 3 years, but some of the larger technology and other trends for pushing farther out. Jeff, a couple minutes.
Great. So what got me excited about this project was the business aspects of information security. And I mean particularly how, if I'm running my business, making widgets, doing whatever it is, how do I think about information security? Why do I care? And what are my responsibilities? What do I do? What does my organization do at the line level? What does my organization do at the board level? So, kind of backing up for a minute, security is not new. And in fact, risk is not new. Organizations, big, small, have been managing risk for as long as there have been organizations. And security is certainly not new. Organizations have always had security concerns. But there are aspects of information security that are very unique and are causing the situation that we're in right now, where there's a lot of consternation and a lot of concern in getting things right. So some of the key differences that businesses have to think about, and this is particularly at a high level, at a board level, at a senior management level, when they're thinking about information security. The roles and responsibilities are not clear in general. From a very high level, roles and responsibilities like, if somebody breaks into my building, I call the local police. If a foreign state dropped a bomb on my building, I would hopefully be in a position to call the State Department or the Department of Defense and ask them for some assistance. It's pretty clear what you do and who the responsible parties are in most traditional types of security. That is certainly not the case in information security. The actors are not clear. If it's a criminal versus an entity trying to commit espionage, or potentially a hostile entity interested in national security sorts of things, do I call the FBI? Do I call my local police? Do I call Department of Homeland Security? It's not clear. It's not clear whether they would answer the phone if you did call, and it's certainly not clear what they would do if they did answer the phone and you were able to talk to them. Similarly, inside the organization, it's not clear where the roles and responsibilities are. So your technical line staff are often the ones that discover these sorts of issues. In many cases, they have the best information about what's actually going on in your organization. But high-level risk management is the role of the board and the senior management. I think it's fair to say that most of the boards that I've interacted with are not full of technologists. They view information security as a nerd problem. Go throw money at it and make it go away. Not a risk management problem, not a problem full of trade-offs. These are important things that boards need to think about when evaluating their operations and their overall risk governance.
Have they been getting better over time? I mean, have you seen that shift over the years?
They have. It's actually started changing, really.
And how do they make that connection?
So up until about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I would say that security, except in a very small number of very sophisticated organizations in the defense industrial base and banking and finance, people that really get it. Information security has been an expense. It's been a cost center. Just tell me what the budget is and how I need to solve it. That is starting to change. People are, I believe, at the board level, starting to be more advised about where their valuable assets are, what the threats might be, some trade-offs that are available. If you want to do this new whiz-bag online thingy, then you are exposing yourselves to these risks. If you want to do business in this country, you're exposed to this new market. That's the plus side. But then you have these intellectual property concerns to be concerned about. So it's certainly getting better. It's certainly changing as of fairly recently, but there's a long way to go. There's also all kinds of new interesting pockets, things like active defense. I'm not going to get into that debate right now, but what is my right to protect myself? If somebody steals my wife's purse on the streets of Chicago, I am actually allowed to chase after that guy, right? Well, how does that translate to the cyber world? It's certainly not clear. Concepts like projecting power. And a corporate organization has never had to think about projecting power before, but yet that's something very, interesting to think about in this case. If you have an adversary that's certainly interested in something you have, letting them know that you know who they are, and you know what they're doing, and you know that they know, and they know that in playing that whole game, right, is something to think about in the cyber world. Organizations have never had to think about that before.
Are they starting to look at their traditional risk management techniques like insurance? What kind of conversations when you're talking with companies, how much does insurance come up?
So that's actually number 3 on my list.
Okay, good. And then we'll go to Larry.
Yeah. So I'll skip number 2 then and go to number 3. Information security is a very young science, and that's one of the problems that we're dealing with right now is the metrics don't exist, the models don't exist, the valuations don't exist. Typically, when you have a risk, you identify your risk, you mitigate it to an acceptable level, given whatever the circumstances are that deem it an acceptable level, and then you either choose to accept or transfer the rest. That's kind of risk management 101. But we're not there yet in information security, right? The valuation models don't exist. The insurance products don't exist. What types of risks you can actually transfer into who and for how much, that we're not there yet in the science. And that when we do get there, which we will, that will add another tool that organizations can use to more completely manage risk.
And we'll make sure we come back to number 2. But I did want to follow up on this insurance. It really struck us. So when we kicked off this project, we had a discussion with Zurich Cyber Risk Fellows, with others. And it was great because we had people from Zurich Insurance. We had underwriters, risk engineers, and business heads. And so we're having this conversation about systemic cyber risk like we talked about on the slides. And the closer people were to insurance, the more we talked about records, the more we talked about, hey, someone's broken into the company and stolen information on 1 million people. And so it became, that's important, but it also is only one of the many kinds of cyber risks that we have to worry about. And this is one, and I'm bringing this up because insurance has a role right now. And this project is starting to look at further downstream. Because the reason that we jumped to looking at records is because it's measurable. Right? Someone breaks in, you can guess, you can look, and you can guess, all right, they took 1 million records, and once it's measured, it can be transparent, you can build insurance models around it. And I think on the systemic cyber risk bit, we're not quite there
that's
yet.
right. I mean, records are clearly the most, everybody understands the value. You have a record compromised that has my name and my social security number in it. You're on the hook for, $8 a year of identity fraud insurance.
Yeah.
That everybody gets that. That's a very well understood dimension, but there's a lot more that are not well understood.
If Paul Toomey were here, one of our board directors, he would also be talking about D&O insurance as well as business interruption insurance, and seeing those being the current waves of probably what's coming next. But I'll leave that to him. Larry, would you like to kind of pick us up from there for a couple
Sure.
minutes?
Thank you. I need to begin with a confession, however. I began thinking seriously about this problem yesterday about 7 o'clock in the morning.
Good.
And I was in the...
That just means we're cutting edge. If
Right.
Larry Castro hasn't thought about it yet, we're at cutting edge.
Well, and I did that by reviewing the charts that you shared with the audience. But the place I was very interesting. My wife was in for the first of 2 cataract surgeries, and my job was to, number one, get her there, and then to wait until she finished, and then to bring her home, and occasionally, if allowed, to ask questions about what was going on, because this is a very technologically intensive and miraculous, I would tell you, thing that's done today when you can take a cataract, a lens, replace it with a lens that's been tooled to not only heal the take away the cataract condition, but also to restore the vision. Such that this morning when my wife went back, it was 20/20 in an eye that could only be corrected to 20/50 beforehand and without cataracts. But while I was sitting there trying to think about systemic risk, I said, what are all the ways that things could really go south while my wife is sitting there under this laser? And it began with, of course, power. It began with, what if there was some software bug in that program that lined up her map of what the back of her eye looked like and the optics? Because again, if you haven't gone through this, the amount of preparation is just extensive. So I became very point-oriented to risk at that time and not systemic. But then my mind also went back to the first time I encountered a problem that might be concluded a systemic problem. And I would ask how many in this audience, I won't say were alive, I think you all were alive at the time of the Morris worm, but how many of you were around enough to appreciate it? Okay, so my job at the time was chief of R&D in what NSA at that time immodestly called the National Cybersecurity Center. This is now Morris worm time. But I did have occasion to bring together everybody in the United States who worked that problem about 3 weeks later. Although what I learned there was that it was a very, very informal structure of folks, primarily led by Gene Spafford out of Purdue, who actually did all of the triaging, who did all the remediation. And I learned a lot about information sharing at that point of view. But I also, at that time, I remember that was a very, very different net than we have right now. But there was resilience all over the place. This wasn't something, it did for the first 24 hours cause a lot of concern and did, in fact, bring what was a beginning of a transition out of the ARPANET down. On the other hand, this week I had occasion to preview a film that I guess I would recommend to you. It's going to be on the National Geographic Channel this Sunday at 9 o'clock. It's called American Blackout. And it's mostly a film that urges you, at least after I did my preview, I went down and at least counted the number of liters of water that we had stored in our basement. But it begins with the premise that the entire electrical grid in the United States is brought down by, quote, a cyber attack. No further information provided
Dun, dun, dun.
till the end of the program, when you're told that on day 10, someone has recovered the malware, and immediately all the lights come on, even though the main thing that seems to have happened is that the malware caused electrical transformers to explode. But somehow all these transformers got replaced. But my point is that clearly was an attempt to portray a massive, in the terms of Jason's briefing, external force shock that perturbed the system. I think the answer to what we really face is somewhere between my concern at 7:20 yesterday morning that somehow the laser wouldn't quite cut the right place and what's portrayed in the National Geographic film. Where I do identify with the analysis is in the notion that our country, quite frankly, does not have a governance structure that allows us to begin to either prepare for or recover from, in some other than very chaotic way, from a massive cyber outage. And I say that from a perspective of a guy who worked the problem in government for a good amount of time. There's a lot of people who are working very hard in government to do this, but I just don't see all the piece parts wired up. And where that manifests itself particularly in an area that I think has relevance to this discussion is, again, one of the vulnerabilities in Jason's slides is to talk about the lack of transparency, the lack of having a place where there's common situational awareness about what's going on the net that would impact how we would seek to defend ourselves either individually as private sector companies or as governmental entities. And the place where it then translates into the insurance dimension of the discussion, at least again to the limited extent that I've had discussions on this topic, is that as I understand insurance, which may not be totally accurate, this is basically a numbers game. But for the insurance folks to do their numbers game, you need to know what the rate of accidents are. And again, within our country, there is no commonly accepted database that would give you that actuarial information that would allow folks to come up with underwriting schemes that would account for the risk and still make this a profitable venture for the insurance folks. So those are sort of my thoughts. And again, I didn't mean to give you so much personal stuff, but I had blocked that 2 hours yesterday morning where I knew I was going to be waiting to try to do a little preparation here. But I was amazed at how quickly I became personal about the topic.
Yeah. Well, first, I'm sure we all speak for everyone, hoping that everything did go well and everything continues to go well.
Yeah, right.
I'm happy to say that the after action report, I actually got a copy. I FOIA'd that for our. We did our first cyber conflict history book, and we're coming up on 25 years. I think within the next couple of weeks, 25th anniversary of the Morris worm, and it was one of these big, one of the large shocks. And what I really like about your point about governance is we've had these continuing set of wake-up calls. Can I get my prop? No, just the book. That of, excuse me. So our first cyber conflict history book, which came out this summer. And we noted from the Morris worm on, every single one of the big external shocks that we had, from Morris worm to Chinese espionage, certainly Buckshot Yankee. We had this process of governance, like we talked about, of saying, oh my gosh, who's in charge? And in the early days, it was SPAF. And after eligible receiver Solar Sunrise, it was Arnold Abraham and Dusty Rhodes in this room and a couple others. And in Buckshot Yankee, it was General Alexander and some others, and it was always not quite enough, certainly on the government side. And it's interesting that we still feel that even 25 years on, at the 25th anniversary. Now, to really put this into the frame of the systemic, and I'm curious on your thoughts on that, is can we get to this place? Finance, one of the things that went wrong with finance was every company, every country had their own standards. And you would see different standards, and a national parent in one company, in one country, would say, you keep your money here, you take care of us here in Germany first before you take care of your branches in Greece. And this national tug of war. So I'm curious, we have this governance within just in the United States, but if we really have something cyberspace, we're at least as interconnected. How do you think things are looking there? Do you think that might work?
Well, again, the place where I could most intimately comment are on the very long and historic Five Eyes relationships.
Oh, yeah.
I think in that context, we're about as tight as we can be with those who are like-minded. Yeah. Going beyond that, I'm aware that, for instance, a lot of good work being done in and with Japan. And increasingly now, as this becomes a topic of interest in the Middle East, a little bit of attempt to do work there. I'm not aware of any outreach to South America, where there's certainly a lot of the problem. So I think it's mixed. Again, I think this is high on the agenda of those in government who are responsible, but the pace just doesn't seem to be keeping up with what our expectations are of it.
Yeah, and two last points. And one, a lot of what happened in finance was a crisis of trust, a crisis of confidence. You know, there was money in the system, but no one wanted to lend it. So we think it's an interesting trend of what we're looking at right now as countries are making cyberspace more national security and more a national security space, that might affect the trust because national security people don't trust other countries' national security people quite as much. So what might that mean in that tug of war? Okay, great. Oh, and I'm sorry. One thing that does make me feel a little better is that when we did the history, who led the response in the Morris worm? It was the private sector, essentially. And who led the response in Estonia and Georgia and a lot of these others? It's tended to be the private sector. So I'm curious as we look at the systemic cyber risk, as we go down, does it have to be government that imposes systemic controls like finance does with the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, or can you get that handle some of that systemic risk just by the private sector? I don't know. Do you have any thought? Do you think the private sector can, like NANOG, NSP, SEC,
I think
certs?
Many in the audience know that there are pockets of strength in the financial sector where over time there have been relationships built up, particularly in the financial sector where people do exchange information freely, even if it might put their own particular corporate entity at a disadvantage. I don't see that extending as a model throughout. And I am really most concerned that with respect to private sector obtaining information from government, that it still is very much on who do you know, who can you pick up, which electronic task force Secret Service guy can you call who you worked with in D.C. Back when you have a problem in your area, and find out what's going on or getting that help. It's not universal for everybody.
Yeah. Before I go to Matt, I did want to just go back to Jeff for a second. So Jeff, you're doing a lot of work right now with ICANN. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of work in the DNS and the rest. That's been pretty resilient, and it seems like it's been pretty resilient with multi-stakeholder model. I mean, do you still see that being healthy for the next couple of years?
Sure. So I mean, there's two questions there wound up. The technical model, right, for the core internet protocols, DNS, BGP, have actually proven to be fairly resilient over time. There's arguments, both ways, and there's always vulnerabilities and there's always concerns. But just by our experience, these protocols have tended to hold up under a fairly constant barrage, over the history of the internet. One of the reasons that the technical protocols work so well is actually dovetailing from your comment about the private sector, leading these incidents. When there have been incidents involving the core protocols, involving the DNS and such, it tends to be a private sector driven technical response, which has been highly effective.
And I think that's great. On do we have to go to government to take away systemic cyber risk? I think so. You'd be saying we haven't. The system's been resilient for years, and it's been the private sector non-states that's gotten us there.
Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean it always will be.
Yeah.
But certainly experience has shown that it's worked.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it strikes me when I first got into this business, and I'm sorry I'm being nostalgic, but some of the people that got me into the business, Ardell, Dusty, and a few others are here. We'd sit around the Pentagon, when we would get asked 15 years ago, we would say, oh, the big attack, it's coming in 5 years, baby. And then 10 years ago, when we were asked, we would say, oh, it's 5 years out, it's coming. And now you read testimony, and what's the testimony? Oh, that big attack is coming in 5 years. And so there's obviously some other dynamic going on. Or we've just been lucky, right? So I'm really curious, and Matt, you've been looking at a lot of these trends between, and been doing this for a long time, but particularly between now and 2030, how do you see these disruptive technologies and these other disruptive trends that can inform this discussion?
Well, I think actually the risks are going up. I mean, I think there's a structural change. I mean, we talked a lot about it in the last Global Trends on individual empowerment. So on a lot of the new technologies, the bar is pretty low for individuals to get into it. It's just not a matter of nation states that are posing the risk. So I think in most cases, I mean, you know, this is a good process. You get people really engaged. It opens up a lot of, and we've seen this in opportunities, but there are a lot of bad guys out there as well. So, you know, it's the same thing replicated, you could say, in biotech, where we've also seen the bar lowered in terms of the harm and disruption that an individual or small group can do, almost to the level of a country. And I think there's where, you know, at the moment, you know, the big threats are still, I'd say, at the national level, but over time you could see the networks, criminal networks, some of the terrorist networks. I mean, that's what, of course, the intelligence community worries about, will get actually much more sophisticated where they haven't. And then the other thing that, you know, in a general risk way, I don't think we have, people talked about a science here. I don't think we're anywhere near that science. I mean, there's a similar problem, I think, on the global supply chains, understanding just how that works. And obviously, one of the methods that we used in thinking of the big systemic was scenarios, and I think that is one effort. But that takes a lot of time, and I think also a certain amount of creativity involved in it, because there are just some very dissimilar things that come together or can come together and create much bigger disruption than if they happen singly and disrupted the system.
Yeah, and that's a lot what we were worrying about. Not the single, but the several happening at the same time that especially form a cascade.
Yeah, I mean, we did, you know, if you, I guess, really want to scare yourself, going back to the electrical grid, we did an exercise with Oak Ridge when we were producing the book to think about what are the existential threats out there. And one of them actually was on solar storm, which has happened in the past, and the likelihood that it would bring down the grid. And then the problem is, how do you bring that grid back up? Which no one's had to do it on such a large level, and you don't have, it's not clear how that would happen.
So as you're looking over the report and you're looking at, because I know you did a lot of work with Silicon Valley and other technology centers around the world, you know, we only kind of touched on some of those. You know, we're starting to get our arms around mobile and cloud. But do you see other disruptive technologies that 5 years out, 10 years out, are really going to shift the nature of what we mean by internet and cyberspace?
Well, I think you had it up on one of your, you know, the internet is everything, where you have these, you know, billions or trillions of sensors which are controlling large systems, and obviously what you were talking about, and if there's a malware in the laser system for cataracts, I mean, this could be on a much larger scale, and one that, you know, whole cities can be regulated in terms of water supplies, electricity, and so on. And if you do have an attack on that, you could have extreme disruption. So I think you know, here's this bargain that you're in. I mean, you know, we know that these new technologies increase the efficiency and are very vital when you're talking about saving water supplies, ensuring agricultural production. At the same time, that because you're hooking everything up to the internet, you're obviously becoming more vulnerable.
Yeah. The range of
And
mischief
I'm not
seems
sure that you can ever get out of that. I mean, obviously, we can talk about the redundancies that you can put in, the safeguards. Certainly on some of our talks, going back to the bio theme, I mean, there is some work in Silicon Valley about how that you can basically have a fail-safe system, disrupt whatever the bad guys are going to be doing in terms of putting together a man-made virus, and put that right into some of the bio bricks or building blocks, basically. So you can think about, and I think that's what there'll be a lot of effort thinking about those fail-safe systems. But whether you can ever get to the perfect world, I just have my doubts. And I think just as we've had a succession of financial crises for our whole history, that you may also have a succession of cyber.
And this is what worries me about the smart grid and Internet of Everything, is because part of the reason we're in this problem is we've said, hey, here's a great new technology, we'll roll it out, and then we'll figure out to secure it afterwards. And back from ARPANET and Internet itself to almost every device that we've connected to it since has seemed to follow something along that model. As you've been talking, as people are talking about the new technologies, the new disruptive technologies, are you seeing that model repeated of them saying, let's roll it out and figure out the security later, or are we getting better at this?
I don't think, one of the things that we found out, I mean, in talking to people in Silicon Valley, this was more on the biotech side, is that the community, the security community is not getting together to talk with the scientists sufficiently. And I think that is, I really think that's an issue for government is, again, we're very siloed. So when you're thinking about the threat, you're thinking about the threat in one of those silos. And you're not thinking about how you could have a threat coming at you laterally.
Yeah.
And I think that is the issue, the big issue is the governance, how you design a structure when you can have this really examination across different domains and begin to understand the risks, and then also connect with security and other law enforcement, whatever, to begin to really counteract what the threat was.
Yeah.
Now, on the optimistic side, if you look at, what happened after 9/11, I think, the intelligence community and law enforcement went out and they established a lot of bilateral ties with a lot of states and got cooperation far beyond what people thought, and including went to the UN, which had always, didn't want to deal with the terrorism issue. And you did the Treasury Department, established on the terrorism financing means actually of disrupting. Now, there was a huge amount of effort that went into it, but I think there you see a kind of an imaginative way of counteracting, what was obviously a big threat for this country, and you got a lot more cooperation than anybody previously had thought would be possible. So it's not beyond, I mean, you still have terrorism and it's not going to go away, but you have put in place, I think, a system in which actually you can prevent that, let's hope, anyway, prevent that threat.
Yeah, okay, I've got one more question for you, Matt, but just so to let folks know, so ask Matt this question, then we'll be done with this part of the panel. Do we have questions from Twitter? Okay, I'm going to go to the team here for our questions from Twitter, and then I'll go to Harlan and others in the front here. We'll go till 5 o'clock. I'm going to try and be pretty militant about that. And after that, we'll have a wine social outside so we can help build some of that community. So Matt, so some of the, in 2030 report, you talked about diffusion of power and super empowered individuals. And and we tend to think about that on the negative. Oh, these individuals, and that's going to be bad because they're going to have this power to do all this bad stuff. But of course, it also enables lots of good stuff to happen. In what we're talking about here, the systemic cyber risk, this lack of real governance within the United States or globally to deal with these systemic cyber risks, how do you think that's going to play? I mean, do you think we can use these trends of diffusion of power and super-empowered individuals and groups? Can we get the net plus out of this, or is it largely going to be...
I mean, I think you gave one example already where the private sector, actually figured out ways of diffusing some of the threats, and it wasn't organized by government necessarily. So there you see kind of a non-state actors pulling together. And I think equally, this is a method that the FBI uses when they're trying to track down biohackers and others, is they use the community itself. So the network that person is embedded in can be used to warn about things that just don't look right. And, obviously, for counterterrorism, these, private citizens who come in with information that something seems wrong that actually turn out to be probably the most valuable oftentimes for countering it. So, I mean, those are examples where you've empowered, individuals, small groups, and so on, much more networked, that they can actually be a huge asset in countering the risks.
And hopefully maybe even solve it themselves. I mean, in some of these cases, like in the internet resilience or in Morris Worm, not even really having to or be able to solve the problem and then come to government afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, that innovation and so on is also in the wrong hands.
Right.
Can be deadly.
Okay, so who do we have running mics? I think we're going to do Harlan first, and then I'll do the Twitters because I know. So I saw 1, 2, 3, because I know Harlan has to go. So we'll do Harlan first, and then mic to Harlan, please. Mic to Harlan, please. And then I'm going to do the Twitter questions, and I'm going to do Ron, and then Alan.
I'm Harlan Ullman, the Atlantic Council. Thank you for your presentations, and Jason, good luck. This sounds like a very, very first-rate series. I have two separate questions, one on the financial system and then on the insurance and risk business. Some time ago, a number of us had advocated the analogy of the financial system for dealing with cyber. Obviously, there are standard systemic risks, fraud, crime, flawed fiscal, monetary policies, et cetera, et cetera. But when you use the example of the 2008 crisis, there were probably 10 or 12 actual contributing points. Go back to the 1979 Affordable Housing Act that made housing low cost, which ultimately led to the so-called ninja loans, no interest, no jobs, no assets. You manifest that with very, very low interest rates, then the 99 repeal of Glass-Steagall, which let banks become gambling operations, the fact that credit default swaps were made legal for the first time in almost 100 years during that period, the mistakes of Fannie and Freddie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there were definite points that contributed to that crisis, irrespective.
Right.
I wonder if you've done an analysis yet to see whether there are some inherent flaws, perhaps as blatant as the Glass-Steagall and CDS legalization that exists right now in the cyber world, so that there are actually some data points that you can use rather than just standard systemic risks.
That's interesting.
And regarding insurance, when you buy a car, it has to have an airbag. We just put a new boiler in the house and it's got an emergency cutoff system. It seems to me with cyber, is there any utility in having sort of mandatory safeguards, firewalls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that could be tied to insurance, along with some level of mandatory encryption, particularly for records, so that, for example, if you're a law firm or a bank or whatever, and you want to get insurance, whether it's D&O insurance or whether it's liability risk insurance, unless you have a certain standard of security, you ain't going to get it. You must have thought about both of those.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. And so I think one that gives us an opportunity, especially on the last, maybe talk about the NIST standards and I don't know, Larry, have you been? Can you jump in on the NIST standards?
Sure.
Okay, and also the inherent blatant flaws. I love that, the IBFs. And yeah, you want to take?
Yeah.
Larry, do you want to go first on the? Do you want to go maybe on the mandatory safeguards?
Sure. I think that's a very fine line to be towed, recognizing that you can't be so rigid in these standards that you inhibit innovation. And what you're looking for are more of outcomes as opposed to how to do the job. And fortunately, from what I see now, the most recent version of the NIST framework was just published yesterday. I had hoped to print it off and read it on the way here in the car, but it didn't happen. So I can't tell you what's there. But at least the version before was very much along the lines of establishing best practices, establishing cookbooks with references back to existing standards, because you can recognize that there are some industries, the electric utility industry for one, financial for other, who have been at this for a long time. The last thing they need is another set of overarching standards there. But there clearly does have to be a common baseline for folks, whether it be for insurance purposes or just understanding that you can communicate with somebody with some degree of assurance. But everybody's watching, and I'm sorry, I just didn't get a chance to look at this last NIST version to see how that comes across.
But it's certainly been in DHS has been thinking about using these safeguards specifically for, the NIST standards for a lot of the purposes specifically that you were talking about, even for insurance. I don't know if Tom Finan was here. We were hoping he was going to join. But at DHS, and he's been specifically doing work with DHS on their insurance. And there was hopes that they could use, and insurance might be one of the ways to incentivize companies to use things like the NIST standards. In addition, you've got specific standards for like the credit card industry and others. I don't know. Did John? I saw John Carlson from BITS was here, but I was going to ask him to come in on some of the finance sector. On the first one, the IBFs.
Yeah, sure. So I really liked your kind of walking through all the events that led up to the the financial crisis. And in fact, I'm a pilot. I fly light aircraft, and in aviation incidents, it's rarely a single catastrophic event. The wing doesn't usually fall off, or it's a long series. Right. A missed maintenance. Somebody didn't tighten up a bolt. High cycle time. Tired pilot. High humidity. Blah 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 blah. Right. So there's a long chain that leads to an incident. And of course, hindsight being 2020, you can usually go back and piece together that long chain, but it's very hard to spot it as it's happening, right? So one of the things that I like about this cyber subprime, kind of packaging is, it actually starts to cause us to look at what's adding up, what has snuck up on us, in the last couple of years. So, explosion of computing power, right? Explosion of mobile devices. Explosion of sensor networks. There's sensor networks now everywhere, and they're just getting bigger, right? The computing power, in your cars and in all of those things are adding up. I also, another flying analogy. I learned to fly before we used GPS in light aircraft. And so we actually used math and did trigonometry and looked at paper charts, and it was all very quaint. But now, pilots that learn to fly now are almost entirely dependent on GPS. I can't drive a car now out of my driveway without GPS. But of course we didn't have that. So the way that it occurred to me how quickly this dependence on GPS has snuck up, So, looking at how things are adding up and then what dependencies we might be creating if something did go wrong is I think, a really instructive and interesting way to look at this larger issue. The dependencies we have on third parties, now if you can't, if we've got a conference call in 5 minutes and I email you the PowerPoint in advance and you don't have it in 5 minutes and you're in London, we panic. Well, that's new. I used to, FedEx it to you, and before that, I would courier it, so it's interesting what's happening.
Yeah,
Can I follow up and push back?
Yeah, please.
I am and have been public investment company mutual funds. And when you talk about best practices, in some areas of the financial industry, we are really, really super regulated. Doesn't mean we can't make mistakes. But there are certain standards. SEC usually investigations are pretty good. Compliance is very, very, very real. So there are things that are more than standards. They're regulatory. And in fact, one company, we mandated that we have both inter and intranet, so it's separated from the outside, and put in 256-bit encryption. Now, it seems to me some things like that could be made mandatory, because if you take a look, going back to the financial industries, there are mandatory requirements. So I just wonder if this voluntary approach is being a little bit too passive, especially when the public good, as in the financial system, it could really be at risk.
Understand, and I believe there's some middle ground that establishes not how to do something, but what the objective is. And then if you make sure that that objective is being fulfilled, and there have to be some objective standards for measuring that, as opposed to prescribing how to do and how to solve the problem. Maybe it's not 256 elliptic curves. Maybe it's some new variant of cryptology that is even more robust. And that's all I'm saying. If you start to be very, very specific, the technology in this area will make a specific regulation out of date, possibly even within a year or so.
And you tend to see a lot of the best security in the most regulated industries. You know, it's one of the reasons that finance is so good. A lot of the sharing that happened, one was because there was an organization for it, but Treasury also came out in their guidance to banks was saying, have you joined the FSI-SAC yet? And so banks would say, oh, what's the FSI-SAC? Quick, look that up. And then they would overnight sign up so they could tell their examiner that, yes, we have done this basic thing. And that's just more difficult to do in manufacturing or small business or some of the others. I'm a big fan. If I were advising Phyllis Schneck, who's now the Deputy Undersecretary, took Mark's past job, I think we can do a lot more on the board and the other side, especially for the systemic. I mean, I might start by going to CalPERS and Children's Fund and other companies. If we don't think companies are making the right risk decisions, you can go to boards. You can influence them through shareholders. I think we're still doing a lot of something bad happened. Let's go talk to that company, and that's just difficult to scale to talk about the problems we're doing here. So the NIST standards just came out, and I was pretty pessimistic because we've tried things like standards a lot. One of the underlying things that I think we haven't done well is having a plan and then kind of sticking to it. But I think the standards came out a lot better than I was expecting, because they weren't just, like Larry said, do this specific technical thing. It's here's a risk management process that you ought to follow to be considered that you are doing at least standard practice. Some of the other, I think, inherent blatant flaws. I mean, one was the internet was built on trust. I mean, it wasn't built to be secure. We're still living with that. The increasing dependence that Jeff talked about. I think the increasing of outsourcing makes absolute sense. Just like securitizing made sense. When we first came up with this and pitched to Martin Sen, we said we're cyberizing risk. We securitize the risk for finance, chop it up, sell it off. It gets recombined, sold off, and no one knows where it lies. We're cyberizing the risk. We're outsourcing it. We're supply chaining it, and nobody can tell you where that risk is finally going to end up. Okay. All right. By the way, I wanted to thank Corey Becker. She is helping with the mics. She is volunteering with us as an intern and is looking for cyber jobs. So if you have cyber jobs, keep Corey Becker in mind. Jason Thielen, Associate Director of the program, you have some questions. Let's take one or two from there, and then I'm going to go to Ron, then Alan, then here.
Great. Thanks, Jay. A lot of people following online, hashtag Cyber Wednesdays. Thank you for your questions. I have two for the panel today. First, the project is called the Global Aggregation of Cyber Risks. What have you learned about how the rest of the world is managing cyber risks? And the second one we have designed systems more complex than we can safely and reasonably operate. With that in mind, are there levels of protection that the United States can create to keep us safe?
Can you say that one more time? Just the last half of that one.
With that in mind, are there levels of protection that the United States can create to keep us safe?
Okay, on the first one, rest of the world. Jeff, I'm going to look for you because you have more ROW experience than the rest.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, in general, the rest of the world is struggling with the same issues we are in the United States. That's clear from the work that we do. We were with this project just over, in Rome a couple weeks ago, hearing from a mostly international crowd, and they're dealing with exactly the same sorts of things from the commercial side. From the government side, different governments approach this problem differently, some of those have advantages, and some of those have disadvantages. Some of them create new problems. So, one of the trade-offs with governments that keep more tight control, which may be argued to increase overall systemic security, is then what types of trade-offs are you taking in terms of civil liberties and free speech and things like that. From the kind of roles and responsibilities perspective, I have never seen evidence of a country that really has that nailed yet. No matter where you are and what commercial or government entity you're talking to, who do you call? Where is the red phone? Who answers it when it rings, and what are the first 5 things that they do? When there is a cyber event, whatever that means, is not clear anywhere in the world.
Microsoft had done a great paper that they came out with earlier this year. So Microsoft does cleans. If you say, hey, do you want Microsoft to clean this out of your system, they keep stats on all sorts of great stuff. And they went back and looked at how many computers they clean per 1,000 computers they've got. And they looked for different countries. And that helped them come up with a lot of interesting statistics. And Kevin Sullivan from their team, they've done a number of things with it, particularly looking at, let's look at what different, they looked at it like a social scientist. What can we correlate for the places that are cleanest versus the places that are dirtiest? Do they have a cyber strategy? Have they signed the Budapest Convention? What's their GDP? What's their connectivity? Where do they rank on Transparency International Index? Where do they rate on the Failed State Index? And I think that it's an interesting way to do it because they're looking to say what kind of policies help get you to the most clean spot. Now, I don't remember if that paper called out the Nordics, but in other work I'd seen from Microsoft, the Nordics have just about the cleanest cyberspace anywhere in the world. I mean, there really are countries that have done better. And my take on how the Scandinavian countries have gotten so well was that they tended to work at the ISPs. They tended to do things that scaled more easily by saying, for example, ISPs that wouldn't let I think it was Norway, the cleanest ISP in Norway, which was one of the cleanest countries. If you were infected, they would not let you connect to the internet until your system was clean. And fine, you could keep your system, you could do what you want, but we're not going to let you infect other people to do bad things. And they would put you off, and they'd give you help, as you'd expect from a welfare society. But it was interesting because this has real implications for the rest of us that, I don't know why I'm directing this towards you, Harlan, I like your tie. But you really can see that some of these countries do have different approaches. Other than that, I think you see some that tend to be going towards an American consensus and some that to be going towards more of a much more state-centric than us.
As the flip side of that, though, which is interesting when looking at the Nordics, is the fewer homogeneous systems. It doesn't matter what the system is, right? That are more tightly controlled or more highly administered, may lead to a lower number of failures over time. But when you do have the failures because of lack of diversity in the systems, they tend to be more catastrophic. So it's the old biodiversity of the of the information system argument, and I think we've seen evidence of that in some of the smaller, less diverse.
I could ask clarifying, Jason, on the second question. Were they saying are there specific levels, like specific thresholds, or?
Is that a clarifying tweet?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way I was reading it, it was more technical creation of technical protections. You mentioned insurance or NIST standards and those kind of things. I know we've talked a lot about offensive capabilities in cyber and defense, but I think it was more along the lines of can they build a wall or a moat or some sort of technical capability.
In this case, I'm going to go to Larry in particular and maybe Matt also. When we started, or when I was getting this business, everyone would talk about it was going to be firewalls, IDS systems, IPsec, and everybody was saying this is going to be, when, we roll this out, we're going to be there. Defense is going to be better than offense, or you've seen a long history of those. Do you think that we're one or a few technologies away? And Matt, I might come back specifically to ask about quantum and how that changes. But Larry, any initial thoughts on?
Sure. No, we're not one or two technologies away, nor will we ever be.
Okay.
All right. The advantage always goes to the offense, but at NSA, our motto on the information assurance side is that the real men play defense.
Yeah.
What I think it all boils down to is simply looking at it, and this sounds very tutorial, in the risk management context. And that context says you worry about the threats, you worry about the vulnerabilities, and you worry about the consequences. Today, there's a vibrant new field called cyber threat intelligence that its practitioners would advertise to you that if you sign up for their particular service, they will tailor their watching of the net to tell you who is coming after you. And that allows you at least the advantage of perhaps being a half a day ahead of the attacker. I'm a firm believer in cyber threat intelligence. I don't believe it can do everything that its practitioners say, but I will tell you that it's a very, very good augmentation. We're a small entity at Chertoff Group, so I am also the Chief Security Officer and the CISO. And I depend upon my cyber threat intelligence providers, read their stuff every day, and we fine-tune our defenses based on that. The second part, though, is that the emerging philosophy is to be data-centric in protection. That is to say, we're not going to stop everything, and let's agree up front that we're not going to stop everything, but let's make sure that those things that for our company or our government installation are the crown jewels are maximally protected. Protected both in terms of who internally we allow to have access to, and certainly protected in terms of the number of steps that would have to be gone through and the number of auditing trails that would have to be gone through to move that data out of our system. And then finally, I'll put a big picture in. I'm a longtime advocate of system engineering, which I think is actually the basis of approaching your catastrophic event. And that is to say, you look at every step of the peace process, whatever it is that you do in your company, and you say, where am I most vulnerable? And that's the places where you then really look to put in the protections, whether it's insider threat protections or external protections that you would have. And of course, continuously monitoring all of that data that you're acquiring is a key part to that. And then finally, within DoD, the attitude now and the operational doctrine is presumption of breach. That is to say, we are going to defend as if the enemy was in our system already. It is really amazing how your outlook changes because you do away with a lot of stuff that perhaps you should have been paying for needlessly anyway. But on the other hand, then you have to you need to double down on the things that you are doing. So I would answer the tweeter's question by simply saying, yeah, there's lots of complex things out there, but there have been complex things out there for a long time. My wife, who I referenced before she came up to work at NSA, where I met her, was a programmer on the Saturn launch vehicle. And that was probably the most extensive piece of software that ever went anywhere. So we're dealing with complex things for a long time. I'm not frightened by them.
I get a little, I'm hoping that this isn't entirely true. I do believe it. But if the attackers always will have the advantage, It is great job security. It means that we're never going to get ahead. It means we're going to be having conferences like this for another 20 years, right? So I am hopeful because in almost every part of human conflict, it does shift between between the defense having the advantage and the offense having the advantage. Maybe space warfare and nuclear warfare. It does shift. So I am hopeful if we set it as a goal. Matt, anything to add into that?
No, I think, best go on to Ron's question or others, I think.
Hi, Ron Marks, member here. I happen to be out in Silicon Valley for a couple of days during the shutdown, so you can imagine the kind of conversations I had out there, ignoring the usual kind of teasing that went on with that, good-natured and otherwise. There came through a number of these discussions sort of a common theme, and I guess I'd like your reaction to it. One theme is that this is moving too fast for you guys, meaning the government, to do anything effective with. That in fact, what really should drive this is the marketplace. That we, Silicon Valley, you name the companies, including a couple on Sand Hill Road, that we can take care of this. That if security will be driven by the marketplace desire, back to your risk management, to people to buy this. That in fact, take care of the Chinese, take care of the Russians, keep the perimeter safe. That's fine. Give us some incentive for insurance so that when we engage in these costs, that's fine. But otherwise, stay out of this process. We don't need you. We don't want you. We can take care of this. That's pretty dominant through seven companies I saw out there. So I would be curious to get your reaction to it. I mean, these guys were not extremists in any way, and one or two of them were fairly large firms. So I would be curious because, we're all Washington guys, and my initial response is, this is a great panel, and Jason, it's a great ideas, and this is the kind of thing that we think of. But their viewpoint, I think you've dealt with it too, Matt, quite different from ours at this.
Yeah. I'll let whoever wants to jump on that.
So I spend a lot of time out in the valley and with small companies as well, and for the most part, I agree. Technologists, and small companies in general have proven to be more nimble, in dealing with whatever it is that's thrown at them. But government has to be. Government is an actor in this, right? And particularly when the adversary is not clear, government is an involved player. There's absolutely nothing that I can do, as a private company, about a persistent, foreign espionage threat on my network, other than just try my best to keep them out, 99.9% of the time, and then the 1%, the 0.01% of the time, So there is a national problem that, that Adam Smith says government has to solve. There is a problem with the commons here, and government has to be involved in that. But for the bits and bytes, and in inventing the next greatest protocol and the next greatest this, that, or the other thing, private sector can, should, and would lead that.
I would just add on. I mean, I thought when you say about the perimeter, securing the perimeter, I mean that's something nobody can really do. I mean, it's pretty porous, and that's the whole problem. And
I think more along the lines of we're detecting that it's the Chinese or the Russian for international.
Yeah,
maybe even a group that would be representing a non-nation state. That would be a combination of either a law enforcement or a military action. So I mean that part was that's what it was saying.
Yeah, I mean we see it was interesting when we did the book, which was a fierce domain. The private sector had the agility, subject matter expertise, and their hands deep in cyberspace. When something bad happens, they're able to really fix it. Government has extensive resources, lots of people and money, and access to other levers of power. Whether that's canceling visas or stabbing people, and I think governments at their best when they say, "Good, how can we work on these problems?" And not so well when they say, "All right, let's come in. We're going to run this response. Let's do this others." We want to be doing a lot on coming with a private sector-centric cyber strategy. What would be different instead of saying, so when you write our strategy, say government's going to do, if we said private sector is going to do, and then how do we force them to follow in? For example, like SEC guidance or using private sector's own governance mechanisms to enforce them to do the right things if they're taking the wrong risks. Okay, I'm gonna.
May I just?
Yeah, please.
So there's another actually really interesting
Mike is
flip
gonna
side
go
of
to
this,
Alan.
which is back when a couple weeks ago when we were basically the United States was figuring out whether we were going to attack Syria or not. A lot of large, visible U.S.-based companies started wondering what the impact was going to be of that to their private networks.
Right.
Particularly the financial sector, right? So the financial sector wondered out loud, well, gee, if we start bombing, if the United States makes a decision, the government makes a decision that I'm not a party to, I'm a bank, but I'm going to get the blowback. I'm going to get the activists and everything else going after me. So the inverse of this is happening. That I now as a private sector have to be, aware of the potential blowback of these decisions that the government is making.
October 2013 is a bad month for government to be saying they need to be doing more in cyber. Okay, Mark had a two-finger, and then I'm going to start taking several questions at once, and the questions are going to go to Alan. And
So I have about 1 million thoughts on this.
introduce yourself.
Oh, Mark Weatherford. I'm principal at the Chertoff Group and formerly at Department of Homeland Security. So when I was at DHS, I can tell you the number one question that came up when we had discussions like this, and we had them a lot, was what is the role of government? So we talked a little bit about, the Nordic countries that have this great, pure environment where you can't, you actually regulate who can and can't get on the internet. You look at some of other countries that regulate what you can do and what you can see and what you can say on the internet. In the United States, the internet is primarily a civilian space. It's not a government space. It's not a military space or a DoD space. So while there are dependencies, while the government certainly depends on the internet, I think we get in this very scary territory. At least for us, I think as Americans, we get in this very scary territory when we start thinking about the government reaching in and saying, you are going to this. You are going to follow these standards. And then there are unintended consequences to this as well. When you think about levying standards against different critical infrastructures, how do you identify within a critical infrastructure what is critical? I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the electricity industry. I understand that, and the electricity industry is very good, probably farther ahead than most other verticals with respect to standards and how they respond to them, how they implement them. But even there, from when I was at DHS, going in and working with the electricity industry and in the oil and natural gas and some of the others, they really don't want the government coming in and telling them what to do. I mean, in fact, it's an interesting dichotomy because in most cases, they absolutely do not want the government coming in. They want to deal with it themselves. On the other hand, I probably sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth right now, but on the other hand, there were a number of events when big events would happen, private sector companies would come to me and say, what are you going to do about this? You know who the bad guys are. Why aren't you doing anything about this? And in fact, from a technical perspective, there probably was things we could do, but there are always diplomatic and economic, and there are other components to these that putting a firewall rule in or blocking an ISP doesn't really solve that problem.
Yeah, and this is why I think I'm look forward to a new national strategy, and particularly why we want to push our version of what we think a national strategy should do as private sector centric to help us through. I mean, right now what we have for strategy doesn't necessarily help us prioritize in these, and I think that would help if we could get some of Thank you, Mark. And by the way, this is really difficult to have a panel when we've got, I mean, so many people in the audience are normally panelists themselves. So we do appreciate having this. So let me take some questions here. Alan, first.
I want to go back to Jay's point on sort of thinking about models of risk governance, and I just want to very quickly...
Just introduce yourself.
Sorry, Alan Friedman from the Brookings Institution and chair of a bunch of the past workshops on the economics of information security. Yeah. So I want to contrast two sort of models of risk governance. Jay, you brought up earlier, pardon me, data breach insurance, which is one of the few areas in cyber insurance that has actually functioned. It's probably about 70% of the market. And the reason we have that is not just because a data breach is a discrete event, but there are laws in America that say if you have one, you have to incur cost. And that is what drives a financial market. You have the government that creates discrete particular options, and then the private sector, they did a great job in setting this up, and then the private sector has actually evolved to figure out whether we're going to mitigate this risk or just transfer it. When I compare that with a different side, again in the financial sector, on automatic trading systems, where in some cases we see the market stepping in to effectively bludgeon something out of night capital. But on the other hand, we've also seen, we still don't know, at least publicly, who is responsible for the 2010 flash crash. And Goldman Sachs is sort of up in the air about whether or not Euronext is going to find them at all. So I think we don't have risk government model there.
Yeah, I love your original point, because I love, so I was at Goldman Sachs when the California law came out that said if there's a data breach, you have to tell people. And we just said, great, we're not just going to tell Californian citizens, we'll tell everyone. And to me, it's regulation by transparency rather than regulating for security. And to me, SEC guidance does about the same. It's not trying to impose a new standard of security. It's trying to impose transparency on the system and then letting the rest of private sector handle itself and figuring out what we're going to do with that. Okay, great. And then after that, why don't we get the last three questions, because we got 15 minutes left. So it's going to be 1, 2, and then Andy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Annegret Bendig from the German Institute for International Security Affairs, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. I'm working on European cybersecurity and internet governance. And it seems to me at the moment that the EU, and especially, of course, Germany and the United States, are going separate ways in cybersecurity and privacy. And let me give you some insights about the German discussion at the moment. And I think it's a little bit similar to the US discussion.
We are starting to get short of time. So
yeah, of course. But I think the main difference is that in Germany and the European Union, we will impose minimum standards for security on the critical infrastructure, and we will impose a reporting system to the government. And as far as I know, is that here in the US, this will be organized on a voluntary basis, and so. In this regard, I think these are separate ways, but it poses problems for multinational corporation acting here in the US and at the same time in the EU. And therefore, I think it's absolutely necessary that we find a common way in this regard. And let me say something, a short point on the privacy issue, because you see, this is the amount of articles I printed out today only about NSA revelations in Europe and
we've made
Germany.
It an hour and 45 minutes.
So cloud computing is a hot topic.
No one said APT yet either.
For the European Union. And therefore, I think in this topic, it is also absolutely necessary as regard to the negotiations on the transatlantic free trade and investment agreement that we will find a solution that goes beyond the safe harbor regulation. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Any comments?
I'll just make a real quick comment about the regulation aspect of things. So, like in the United States, companies that act in regulated, the state-regulated spaces, like insurance, like healthcare, like certain aspects of banking, right, deal with 50 jurisdictions in the United States already. and they're irritated as crap about it. And they wake up every morning and they say, I'm a big insurance company and I sell auto insurance in 50 states, and boy, it'd be so much better if I had one way to do it for all 50 states.
Yep.
Yeah, but they do. In the same way, large multinationals that we deal with complain every single day about the fundamental difference, not good, bad, or indifferent, but the fundamental difference between EU privacy regulation and US privacy regulation, or lack thereof. And same sort of thing. They complain about it, but they figure out a way, they make it work. And I don't see I don't see us coming together, the United States and the European Union coming together on those anytime soon. So I think that companies are still going to pretty much just have to figure out a way to deal with it.
But and Atlantic Council is certainly doubling down on TTIP and working to help make that happen. Actually, one of our reports out here I'd highly recommend is we worked with some economists to go state by state to look at what the benefit for TTIP in different states are going to be, and we're going to try and bring that down even to different congressional districts. Also, just when we share to government, a lot of times that doesn't necessarily help because governments will just keep it internally and not share it. So a lot of it is, as you're going down this path, say what actions have to happen, what decisions have to happen, and how do you get information to those people? And those people are not always government. Okay, sir.
Thank you so much. My name is Nicholas Zahn. I'm a student at George Washington University. And I'd like to thank you first for bringing up the
Andy,
interesting
do you have
issue.
to go? Oh, crap. All right.
The interesting issue of systemic risk. But I have a question in that regard. How do you see the question of systemic risk interplaying with the ongoing discourse on the fear of the balkanization of the internet? Because after all, wouldn't on the surface of it a simple response to systemic risk be to have less interconnectedness? So to try to shut different networks off into isolated areas. Thank you.
Any questions? So as we're looking at systemic risk, how does that play in with balkanization of the internet, where you might see the reimposition or the imposition of borders in cyberspace or in internet? Jeff?
Well, I would say
Made the most throat noises there, so.
I would. I mean, again, in general, right? Whenever you put up borders, there's always holes and ways through those borders. Sure. And so I look at it as, in general, balkanization increases complexity, and complexity in almost all cases is the enemy of security and stability. So even though the headline point might be we put up this big wall and things will be better on our side of the wall, that never really works out like that. It usually actually goes the other way.
Yeah, and a specific example from my perspective, when I was Goldman Sachs, we were doing business continuity for Asia, some countries would not let you take their data from that country, which meant that it didn't get backed up. So you're in volcanic, earthquake-prone countries that would not allow the data to be stored outside of that country. Makes sense from data protection standpoint, but it was not safe. It was not more resilient for the overall system. And to get to the earlier question, I'm afraid that's the way we're going to go in. You're already seeing some EU statements now, statements from others saying, don't let your data touch the American cloud, don't let it touch an American company, don't let it touch American soil. And that's starting to put these loose, starting to tighten up the borders in cyberspace. Cyberspace has always had national borders. They're certainly strong for the past, certainly been there for the past 15 years or so, since the Yahoo decision and others. They've just been fuzzy. And now you're starting to see, especially as we make it more and more national security space, those start coming in. So it's not going to be good for systemic risk as a whole. But it's so interesting how it does match the kinds of things that finance sector went through. Is Deutsche Bank a German bank or is it a global bank? Bank for International Settlements came in and said it's a German bank, but you also have to hold separate money aside because if something happens there, it's going to affect all of us. Okay. Any last questions? I wanted to get Andy Purdy, but I guess Andy had to run, so apologies to Andy. Any final questions? Oh, yeah, hi.
Hi, Bijan Madani, I'm a lawyer. This is probably more for Jeff and maybe for Matt. I was at a couple of other sort of IGF security conferences in the past couple of weeks, and something that's come up is the new GTLD protocols and how individual organizations are sort of going to become their own sort of DNS programs and going to have certificate authority within those programs. Does that strike you as a risk coming up in the near future, where certificate authority collisions are usually a problem going forward for viruses and for malware? Do you think that's going to be a problem, say, for, let's say, Microsoft having its own certificate authority, or for another smaller organization?
We're getting geeky. All right. Can you explain
we
that?
got to the last question before.
I know.
So,
can you explain that?
yeah. So very briefly.
Because this is your business, right?
Yeah, we're up to our eyeballs in this stuff now. So ICANN is in the process of introducing new, what are called GTLDs, generic top-level domains. So right now we have .com, .net, .org, and we'll have 1,600 more over the next couple years. So that's happening now. It's been happening for quite a while. I actually think the first couple were delegated today. So very current news or very current events. One of the recent issues that has come up very recently with respect to this program has to do with people that are using namespaces right now that may collide with these namespaces that are not yet delegated. So, for example, I run .jeff, inside my condo, and if something happened to leak out, .jeff doesn't resolve on the internet now, so I just get back with no, can't find that response, and nothing happens. But let's say that at some point in the future, .jeff, were delegated and did respond. So now something that leaked out of my network, did resolve, and who knows what it would resolve to, and who would be resolving it. And then this issue with certificate authorities, which is another that's a more of a religious debate, because the certificate authorities are, I apologize if anybody's a certificate authority in here related, but it's a totally broken authentication model. It's a totally broken trust model. And so the people that are concerned about the certificate authorities trust model being broken because of new delegations, it doesn't fly because it's already broken. Your browser right now trusts 100 organizations that you've never heard of, right? So the namespace collisions, though, is interesting because certainly the data indicates that there have always been namespace collisions. And there are a lot of namespace collisions in all of the domains that are delegated today. In fact, companies build their businesses around monetizing namespace collisions in top-level domains like .com. If I registered jeff.com and I had a bunch of people come into jeff.com, and then my registration expired, there's 100 companies that have set up their systems to pounce on that registration, send it to themselves so that they can get my traffic and show me ads and monetize it, right? So to say that top-level collisions are any different than any of the other, million types of collisions that we face every day, even, we all get wrong numbers on our phone, we all get mail addressed to other people. It's unclear. This is an area that's being looked into now. There's a lot of research, being done. ICANN is up to their eyeballs in this. We've stuck a toe in it in a couple of areas. Do
you see any systemic risk in any of the other things that are happening? So we got the GTLDs, we got the native language,
well, from
the
a systemic,
other than English.
From a systemic risk standpoint, I would give you a flip answer, which I've given before on this, which is if I have a critical system that is so fragile that it is depending on NX domains coming back from the internet because my system is broken and requiring that, then better we find them now than some adversary finds them later, right? That's the flip answer to the systemic issue.
That reminds me of something that Bill Woodcock had said from Packet Clearinghouse, because as we were talking about these complexities, he said there's two dirty little secrets. One was that we're outsourcing, but even at the ISPs and the people that are far upstream from us, they're doing the same thing. They're saying, what's our core business, and let's outsource the rest. The other one is things are so complex that everybody is just saying, oh, that broke? Oh, I guess those two things had a dependence on one another. I guess we should fix them. And it's spotting the dependencies after the breaking, because it's just getting it's getting itself unmodelable. So I'm
Yeah,
sorry
yeah.
to
No,
take you off, but go ahead.
So that's a very narrow piece, right? I mean, the critical infrastructure dependencies, they should be found, they should be fixed. All the other things, it's an open question right now. I mean, it really is an open question. The dependencies with respect to collisions are not well understood right now, and research is being done. With respect to the other thing you mentioned, IDNs, so right now, most domain names are typed in Latin characters, no matter where you are in the world. Technology has been invented to allow you to type non-Latin characters in domain names up to and including the top-level domain.
So in Chinese characters or
Right.
Cyrillic or
Right. So I think IDNs add a certain level of complexity to the system. Registering the IDNs, managing the IDNs. There's an aspect getting really into the weeds called variants, where you have, for example, a traditional Chinese version of a word and a simplified Chinese version of a word. There's a lot of complexity associated with IDNs that certainly don't help, reduce risks, but I think we're going to find those, and those are going to need to be worked out over the next, months and years. But I think it's important to bring the internet, to the rest of the world in non-Latin characters.
Yep.
So.
Okay, just in closing, I'm sorry, I know we might have had some more, and I'm sure we had lots on Twitter. Last comments. Actually, let me put out first. So we hope that we'll see everyone again next 20 November. Thinking about doing that one about electrical, but we still have to confirm. Mark, let's talk. All right, and just see if you have any final closing remarks, and we'll go ding, ding, ding.
I've talked enough, so
Okay.
I'm good.
Mr. Castro.
I'd like to come back to your comment about way back when we were predicting the threat 5 years down. I was one of those guys also looking for it. The sad part is, and I feel badly too, that while we were doing that, we were having our clocks cleaned in terms of the loss of intellectual property. So it's a matter of which eye do you keep on which prize.
Yeah, great, thanks. Mr. Burrows.
I would just encourage, when you're thinking about the cyber risks, also keep in mind the other risks that actually are, I think, climbing up as well in a lot of the other domains, and keep your eye on those kind of lateral factors that may play in.
I think that's great, because we might end up with cyber shock because of another earthquake, like 26 December 2006 in Asia that takes out the submarine cables, or we might get there in any number of ways. That's a great point. Thank you very much. All right, so 20 November, we hope to see you all again. Also on 1 November, we're going to be having a conversation on Indian cyberspace with Ambassador Reddy from... Reddy. Thank you, Jason. He's the one with the facts and the brain. And so we have wine and some other stuff set up outside. We're doing this event to do two things. To hear smart people talking about systemic cyber risk, and we did that. Also to build community, and we're going to do that about 5 minutes immediately with the wine outside. But my program is called the Cyber Statescraft Program. And you get... Cyber Statecraft is built by statesmen and stateswomen, and so this is our Cyber Statesman mug, and I wanted to thank Larry Castro, because you have been a cyber statesman through your whole career, so I wanted to present you the Cyber Statesman mug.
Very kind.
Thank you very much. And with that, you can fill that with wine, because we are complete. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.